Sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when we least expect them. In a world where age often means being overlooked, where experience gets dismissed for youth, where assumptions cloud our judgment, there comes a moment that shatters everything we thought we knew. This is the story of Frank Morrison, a 72-year-old man whose trembling hands held secrets that would leave an entire crowd speechless. What happened in those few seconds would remind everyone present that heroes don't always look the way we imagine them to. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Community Center as people began gathering for what would become one of the most talked-about events in the small town's history. It was supposed to be a simple fundraising event for the local veterans organization, the kind of gathering that happened every year without much fanfare. Tables were set up with donated items for auction, folding chairs arranged in neat rows, and a small stage decorated with red, white, and blue bunting that had seen better days. Frank Morrison arrived early, as was his habit. At 72 years old, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had carried him through more than most people could imagine. His gray hair was neatly combed, his clothes pressed but showing their age, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he carried a small folding chair to a spot near the back of the room. The trembling wasn't new. It had started a few years back, a reminder that time was catching up with him whether he liked it or not. Most people in town knew Frank, but few really knew him. He was the quiet man who lived alone in the small house on Maple Street, the one who kept his lawn perfectly manicured and always nodded politely when neighbors passed by. He shopped for groceries on Tuesday mornings, attended the Methodist church on Sundays, and could be seen taking slow walks around the neighborhood park most evenings. To the casual observer, he was simply another elderly resident living out his golden years in peaceful anonymity. What people didn't know about Frank Morrison could fill volumes. They didn't know about the Purple Heart tucked away in a shoebox in his bedroom closet, or the faded photographs of young soldiers who would never grow old. They didn't know about the nightmares that still occasionally jolted him awake, or the way certain sounds could transport him back to places he'd spent decades trying to forget. They didn't know that behind his quiet demeanor was a man who had once been one of the most skilled marksmen in the United States Army. As more people filed into the community center that Saturday morning, Frank watched from his corner seat. There were families with children, veterans from more recent conflicts, local business owners, and community leaders. The energy in the room was positive but subdued. This was, after all, a small-town event where everyone knew everyone else, and excitement was often measured in gentle smiles and polite applause rather than wild enthusiasm. The event's organizer, Margaret Chen, was an energetic woman in her 50s who had moved to town 5 years earlier and thrown herself into community involvement with the zeal of someone trying to prove she belonged. She bustled around the room, checking on volunteers, adjusting decorations, and making sure everything was perfect for what she hoped would be their most successful fundraiser yet. Margaret had big plans for this year's event, including several new activities designed to draw in younger participants and raise more money for veterans programs. Among the morning's planned activities was something Margaret had seen at a county fair the previous summer, a shooting gallery with air rifles and paper targets. She thought it would add an element of fun and nostalgia to the event, reminding people of the carnival games of their youth while staying appropriate to the veterans theme. The setup was simple. Participants would pay $5 for 3 shots at small paper targets, with prizes awarded for different levels of accuracy. The rifles were basic air guns, the kind used at state fairs across America, and the targets were standard paper circles with scoring rings. By mid-morning, the shooting gallery had attracted a decent crowd. Young fathers were stepping up to try their hand, sometimes with mixed results, that drew good-natured laughter from their families. Teenagers took turns showing off for their friends, though most discovered that shooting accurately was harder than it looked in movies. Even some of the local veterans tried their luck, with varying degrees of success that sparked friendly competition and storytelling about their military days. The atmosphere around the shooting gallery was relaxed and jovial. People cheered for good shots, offered encouragement after misses, and generally enjoyed the simple pleasure of a community activity. The volunteer running the booth, a local hardware store owner named Bill Santos, kept up a steady stream of commentary and encouragement that added to the festive mood. It was just past 11 o'clock when Frank Morrison slowly made his way toward the shooting gallery. He had been watching the activity from his seat, observing the participants with the careful attention of someone who understood what he was seeing in ways others might not. The tremor in his hands seemed more pronounced as he approached, perhaps from the effort of standing and walking, or maybe from something deeper that stirred when he looked at those rifles. As Frank reached the booth, the conversation around him gradually shifted. It wasn't that anyone said anything openly rude, this was a polite community, and Frank was a respected longtime resident. But there were subtle changes. Voices became a bit more careful, glances were exchanged, and the easy laughter quieted somewhat. Here was an elderly man with visibly shaking hands approaching a shooting gallery, and while no one wanted to be unkind, the situation seemed potentially awkward. Margaret Chen noticed the change in atmosphere and felt a flutter of concern. She had organized this event to be inclusive and fun for everyone, but she also didn't want anyone to be embarrassed or, worse, to accidentally get hurt. Air rifles were generally safe, but they still required basic physical coordination and control. She moved closer to the booth, ready to intervene if necessary, though she wasn't sure exactly what she would say. Bill Santos, manning the shooting gallery, found himself in an uncomfortable position. Frank Morrison was standing at the counter with a $5 bill in his trembling hand, clearly intending to participate. Bill had to make a quick decision about how to handle the situation. He knew Frank by reputation, a quiet, dignified man who had lived in town for decades. But he also saw the obvious tremor in Frank's hands and wondered if this was such a good idea. The small crowd that had gathered around the shooting gallery was now paying close attention to what would happen next. Some were clearly curious to see how this would play out, while others seemed uncomfortable with the potential for an embarrassing situation. A few people whispered quietly among themselves, and while their intentions weren't malicious, their concern was obvious. Frank seemed oblivious to the attention he was drawing. He placed his $5 on the counter and looked at Bill Santos with steady, patient eyes. "I'd like to try," he said simply, his voice quiet but clear. There was no boastfulness in his tone, no indication that he was trying to prove anything to anyone. He simply wanted to participate in the community activity like everyone else. Bill hesitated for just a moment before accepting the money and reaching for one of the air rifles. "Sure thing, Mr. Phil Morrison," he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "3 shots at the target. Take your time." He handed Frank the rifle, noting how the older man's hands continued to shake as he accepted it. As Frank took the rifle, the trembling in his hands seemed to become more pronounced. Several people in the small crowd exchanged glances, and someone near the back was heard to mutter something about this maybe not being such a good idea. The atmosphere had definitely shifted from festive to somewhat tense, though everyone tried to maintain their polite facades. Margaret Chen moved even closer, positioning herself where she could step in quickly if needed. She was torn between wanting to respect Frank's dignity and wanting to prevent what looked like it might become an uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. Her mind raced through possible scenarios. What if Frank's shots went wildly off target? What if someone got hurt? What if he became embarrassed in front of the whole community? Frank, meanwhile, seemed completely focused on the rifle in his hands. He examined it briefly, checking its weight and balance with movements that, despite the tremor, suggested a familiarity with such weapons that wasn't immediately obvious to most observers. He then turned his attention to the paper target at the far end of the booth, a standard circular target with scoring rings, placed about 20 feet away. The crowd had grown slightly as word spread that something interesting might be happening at the shooting gallery. More people drifted over from other parts of the community center, some drawn by curiosity, others by the subtle tension that seemed to have developed around the elderly man with the shaking hands and the air rifle. Young Tommy Martinez, who had been showing off his shooting skills to his girlfriend just minutes earlier, watched with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement. At 19, he possessed the casual confidence of youth and had managed to hit the target's outer rings twice in his 3 attempts, earning modest applause from his friends. The idea of this elderly man with trembling hands trying to do better struck him as almost comical. Sarah Peterson, a local teacher in her 30s, found herself feeling genuinely concerned for Frank's dignity. She had always liked the quiet older man, remembering how he had helped her carry groceries to her car during a snowstorm the previous winter without being asked. She hoped he wouldn't embarrass himself, but she also couldn't help wondering what he was thinking. Attempting something that required such steady hands when his were so obviously unsteady. Even some of the other veterans present seemed uncertain about what they were witnessing. Jim Bradley, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, respected Frank as an elder in the community but wondered privately what branch of service he might have been in, and when. Frank's military service, if any, wasn't something he ever discussed, leaving others to speculate based on his age and the general knowledge that many men of his generation had served during Vietnam. There was something about the intensity of his concentration, the professional way he was handling the rifle despite his age and physical limitations, that commanded attention in a way none of them had expected. Frank's finger found the trigger, and for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it actually was. Everything in the community center seemed to pause. The ordinary sounds of the fundraising event. Conversations, laughter, the scraping of chairs faded into background noise as a small crowd of people found themselves holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when the quiet old man with the trembling hands finally pulled the trigger. What happened next would change how everyone in that room thought about assumptions, about age, about the quiet heroes who walk among us every day without fanfare or recognition. In the space of 3 quick shots, Frank Morrison was about to remind an entire community that some skills, once learned in the crucible of necessity, never truly fade. They only wait for the right moment to resurface and remind the world that experience and expertise don't always announce themselves with fanfare. The first shot was about to be fired, and no one in the room was prepared for what they were about to witness. The silence in the community center was almost complete, as Frank Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. Margaret Chen found herself holding her breath, still positioned where she could step in if necessary, though something about Frank's posture was beginning to make her reconsider her assumptions. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 30 people, all watching with varying degrees of curiosity, concern, and barely concealed expectation of an embarrassing miss. The sharp crack of the air rifle cut through the silence like a whip snap. In the fraction of a second that followed, everything changed. The paper target 20 feet away now had a perfect hole dead center in the bullseye. Not near the center. Not close to the center. Exactly. Precisely. Impossibly in the center of the target, creating a hole so perfectly placed it looked like it had been made with a hole punch rather than an air rifle pellet. For a moment, nobody moved. The crowd stared at the target in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Bill Santos, who had been running the shooting gallery all morning and had seen dozens of attempts with varying degrees of success, blinked hard and looked again at the target, then at Frank, then back at the target. Tommy Martinez, the 19-year-old who had been quietly amused by the elderly man's attempt, felt his jaw drop slightly. His own best shot had barely caught the outer ring of the scoring area, and he had been proud of that. What he was looking at now was a level of precision that seemed almost impossible, especially from someone whose hands had been visibly shaking just moments before. Sarah Peterson, the teacher who had been concerned about Frank's dignity, found herself staring not at the target but at Frank himself. The tremor in his hands was still there, but as he held the rifle, as he maintained his shooting stance, there was something about his entire bearing that had transformed. This was not the same frail, elderly man who had approached the booth just minutes earlier. This was someone else entirely. Margaret Chen felt a strange chill run down her spine. She had organized this event as a simple community fundraiser, never expecting to witness anything like what had just happened. The precision of that shot suggested a level of skill that went far beyond casual familiarity with firearms. This was professional-level marksmanship, the kind that came from extensive training and, more importantly, extensive experience under conditions where accuracy wasn't just desirable, it was essential for survival. Frank Morrison, however, seemed completely unaffected by the stunned reaction of the crowd. He simply worked the bolt action of the air rifle to chamber the second pellet, his movements economical and practiced. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement of the reaction he had caused. He was simply preparing for his second shot with the calm focus of someone who had done this thousands of times before under circumstances far more challenging than a community center fundraiser. As Frank raised the rifle for his second shot, the crowd pressed closer. Word was spreading quickly through the community center that something extraordinary was happening at the shooting gallery. People from other parts of the event began drifting over, drawn by the unusual silence and the sense that they might be missing something significant. Among the newcomers was Robert Hayes, a retired Marine who had served in the First Gulf War and now worked as a security guard at the local bank. Robert had been browsing the auction tables when he heard someone mention that the old guy at the shooting gallery had just made an impossible shot. Skeptical but curious, he made his way over to see what the fuss was about. One look at the target with its perfectly centered hole and at Frank's professional shooting stance told Robert that something very unusual was indeed happening. Also joining the crowd was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the town's only practicing physician, who had been helping with the first aid booth earlier in the morning. She had known Frank Morrison as a patient for several years, had treated him for the minor ailments that come with age, and had noticed the progressive tremor in his hands during his recent visits. What she was seeing now challenged everything she thought she knew about the quiet elderly man's physical limitations. Frank's finger found the trigger for the second time. Again, that moment of perfect stillness seemed to settle over him, as if some internal mechanism was shutting out all distractions, all external noise, all awareness of anything beyond the rifle in his hands and the target 20 feet away. His breathing slowed, became measured and controlled, and for just an instant, even the tremor in his hands seemed to disappear entirely. The second shot rang out, sharp and definitive. Another perfect bullseye. Not just close to the first shot, but so precisely placed that the second hole was touching the first, creating what looked like a single, slightly elongated opening in the exact center of the target. The accuracy was so extreme that several people in the crowd actually gasped audibly. Bill Santos found himself staring at the target in disbelief. In his 3 years of running shooting galleries at various community events, he had never seen anything approaching this level of precision. Even experienced hunters and competitive shooters typically scattered their shots across the target area. What Frank Morrison was demonstrating was something entirely different, a level of consistency and accuracy that spoke to training and experience far beyond anything Bill had encountered in civilian life. The whispered conversations in the crowd had changed from concern and barely suppressed amusement to awe and confusion. People were asking each other questions that no one could answer. Who was this man? Where had he learned to shoot like this? What was his story? The quiet, unassuming neighbor they thought they knew was revealing depths that challenged everything they had assumed about him. Robert Hayes, the retired Marine, moved closer to get a better look at both the target and at Frank himself. Hayes had extensive weapons training and had served with some excellent marksmen during his military career, but what he was witnessing went beyond good military training. This was the kind of shooting that came from specialized roles, from situations where missing wasn't just disappointing. His mind began racing through possibilities, trying to piece together clues about Frank Morrison's background that might explain this extraordinary display of skill. Margaret Chen realized that her simple community fundraiser was rapidly becoming something much more significant. The crowd around the shooting gallery had grown to nearly 50 people, and more were still arriving as word spread. The energy in the room had completely changed from casual community gathering to something approaching electrifying anticipation. Everyone wanted to see what would happen with the third and final shot. Dr. Walsh found herself studying Frank with professional fascination. The transformation she was witnessing seemed to go beyond simple muscle memory or retained skills. The man standing at the shooting gallery bore little resemblance to the elderly patient she knew, who struggled with occasional balance issues and whose hand tremor had been progressively worsening. This Frank Morrison stood with military precision, handled the rifle with expert confidence, and demonstrated a level of focused concentration that seemed to override his physical limitations entirely. Young Tommy Martinez felt a mix of emotions that he was struggling to process. His earlier amusement at the elderly man's attempt had been replaced by something approaching awe, but also by an uncomfortable realization about his own assumptions and prejudices. He had looked at Frank Morrison and seen only age and physical limitation, never considering that behind the quiet exterior might be experiences and capabilities far beyond anything Tommy himself possessed. As Frank prepared for his third shot, the atmosphere in the community center had become almost reverent. People were barely breathing, afraid that any sound might disturb his concentration. Children who had been running around earlier were now standing quietly beside their parents, somehow sensing that they were witnessing something important, even if they didn't fully understand what it was. Frank worked the bolt of the rifle one final time, his movements as smooth and practiced as before. The tremor in his hands was still present, but it seemed almost irrelevant now, as if his body had developed ways to compensate that went beyond conscious control. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and settled into his shooting stance with the same deliberate precision he had demonstrated with the previous 2 shots. The target, 20 feet away, showed two perfectly placed holes in its exact center. The challenge now was whether Frank could achieve something that many people would consider impossible, placing a third shot in the same impossibly small area. Even professional marksmen would find such consistency difficult under ideal conditions, let alone with a basic air rifle at a community fundraiser. Frank's breathing slowed once again, and that peculiar stillness settled over him. For the third time, he seemed to separate himself from his surroundings, from the crowd, from everything except the rifle and the target. The focus was so intense it was almost palpable, and several people in the crowd found themselves holding their breath in sympathy with his concentration. His finger began to tighten on the trigger, and the entire community center seemed to wait in suspended animation for the sound of the third shot. What happened next would either complete one of the most remarkable displays of marksmanship anyone present had ever witnessed, or it would demonstrate that even exceptional skill has its limits. But as Frank prepared to fire that third shot, as 50-plus members of his community watched in breathless anticipation, none of them could have predicted that the remarkable shooting display they were witnessing was only the beginning of a much larger story. The three perfect shots were impressive, but they were merely the opening chapter in the revelation of who Frank Morrison really was and what his quiet life in their small town had been concealing for more than 5 decades. The third shot was about to be fired, and with it would come questions that would transform a simple community fundraiser into a day that would be remembered and discussed in their small town for generations to come. Frank Morrison's carefully maintained anonymity was about to end, and the story that would emerge would remind everyone present that heroes often walk among us in disguise, their extraordinary past hidden behind the mundane details of ordinary daily life. The rifle was steady, the target was waiting, and the truth about Frank Morrison was about to be revealed, one perfect shot at a time. The third shot exploded from the air rifle with the same sharp crack as the previous two, and for a heartbeat, the entire community center seemed frozen in time. Then Bill Santos walked over to examine the target, and what he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. 3 holes, so perfectly aligned that they formed what looked like a single, slightly elongated opening in the exact center of the bullseye. The precision was so extreme that it defied belief. In 30 years of handling firearms, first in the military and then as a civilian, Bill had never seen anything approaching this level of consistent accuracy. "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered, forgetting for a moment that he was at a church-sponsored community event. He looked from the target to Frank, then back to the target, then held it up for the crowd to see. A collective gasp went up from the assembled onlookers. Robert Hayes, the retired Marine, pushed forward to get a closer look at the target. His military training had exposed him to some exceptional marksmen, but what he was looking at now challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of human accuracy with small arms. "Sir," he said, addressing Frank directly for the first time, "I have to ask, what's your background?" Frank Morrison carefully set the air rifle down on the counter and turned to face the crowd that had gathered around him. For the first time since he had approached the shooting gallery, he seemed to become aware of the attention he was drawing. The transformation was subtle but noticeable. The intense focus that had characterized his shooting faded, and he once again became the quiet, elderly man with trembling hands that everyone thought they knew. "I served," Frank said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." Margaret Chen found her voice. "Mr. Morrison, I had no idea you were in the military. What branch?" Frank hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much he wanted to reveal. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to learn something significant about their quiet neighbor. "Army," he said finally. "Vietnam." The mention of Vietnam sent a ripple through the crowd. Several of the younger people present had only abstract knowledge of that conflict, but the older residents and the veterans among them understood immediately that they were looking at someone who had experienced one of the most challenging and controversial wars in American history. Robert Hayes studied Frank with new understanding. Vietnam veterans had faced unique challenges both during their service and after their return home. Many had struggled with a lack of recognition and support, leading some to keep their military service private. But Robert's experience told him that Frank's shooting ability went beyond standard infantry training. "What was your MOS?" he asked, using the military term for job specialty. Frank's eyes met Robert's, and for a moment, something passed between the two veterans that the civilians in the crowd couldn't fully comprehend. There was a recognition, a shared understanding of experiences that couldn't be easily explained to those who hadn't lived through them. 11 Bravo, Frank said, using the military code for infantry. But then he paused, glanced around at the expectant faces surrounding him, and added quietly, Special assignment. Dr. Walsh, who had been watching the exchange with growing fascination, stepped forward. Mr. Morrison, I've been your physician for 3 years. Your medical history shows you have essential tremor that's been progressively worsening. How were you able to shoot with such accuracy? Frank looked down at his hands, which were indeed trembling slightly. It's funny, he said, his voice still quiet but now carrying a note of introspection. The shaking gets worse when I'm nervous or thinking about everyday things, but when I hold a rifle, when I focus on a target, it's like my body remembers what it used to know. Muscle memory, maybe. Sarah Peterson, the teacher, found herself thinking about the implications of what she was hearing. Special assignment in Vietnam. What does that mean exactly? Frank Morrison looked at the faces around him, at his neighbors and fellow community members who had lived alongside him for years without knowing anything about his past. He seemed to be making a decision, weighing his desire for privacy against the natural curiosity that his shooting display had aroused. I was a sniper, he said finally, the words falling into the quiet community center like stones into still water. The silence that followed was profound. Everyone present understood immediately that they were in the presence of someone whose life experiences were far removed from anything they had imagined. A sniper in Vietnam. The implications of that role, the skills it required, the psychological burden it must have carried, began to dawn on the crowd. Tommy Martinez, the teenager who had been casually amused by Frank's initial approach to the shooting gallery, felt a complex mix of emotions washing over him. Here was a man who had killed other human beings from long distance, who had been trained to end lives with the kind of precision Tommy had just witnessed. It was both fascinating and deeply sobering. Bill Santos carefully set the target down on the counter, treating it now like the historical artifact it had suddenly become. Mr. Morrison, he said respectfully, how long did you serve in that capacity? 2 tours, Frank replied. 68 to 70. I was good at it. He paused, his eyes distant. Too good, maybe? Margaret Chen realized that her simple fundraiser had uncovered a piece of living history. Vietnam War snipers were legendary figures, both feared and respected, and the man standing before them had been one of the best. Why have you never talked about this before? She asked gently. Frank's answer was simple and heartbreaking in its honesty. Who would want to hear about it? When I came home, people didn't exactly celebrate what we'd done over there. It was easier to just put it away, become someone else. Robert Hayes nodded with understanding. Vietnam veterans had faced unique challenges upon their return, often encountering hostility and indifference instead of gratitude. Many had learned to keep their service records private, avoiding the complicated emotions and judgments that their military experience could provoke. Dr. Walsh was processing the medical implications of what she had learned. The tremor you experience now, do you think it's related to your military service? Frank considered the question carefully. Could be. Stress, you know. Things you see, things you do, they stay with you. But like I said, when I pick up a rifle, when I focus on a target, it's like all of that just goes away. My body remembers what it was trained to do. A voice from the back of the crowd called out, "What was your record?" The question came from Jim Bradley, the Afghanistan veteran who had been watching the proceedings with growing respect for the older man. Frank looked uncomfortable with the question. "It's not something I like to talk about," he said quietly. "Numbers don't tell the whole story." But Robert Hayes pressed gently. "With respect, sir, what you just demonstrated here, that level of precision, suggests you were more than just good at your job." Frank Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, at neighbors who had known him as nothing more than the quiet old man from Maple Street. He seemed to be struggling with how much of his past to reveal, how much of the burden he had carried silently for 5 decades to share with these good people, who had no frame of reference for understanding what his life had been. "Confirmed kills?" he asked, as if making sure he understood the question. When Robert nodded, Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly that people had to strain to hear him, he said, 93. The number hit the crowd like a physical blow. 93 confirmed kills meant that Frank Morrison had ended 93 lives during his service in Vietnam. For many people present, this was their first direct encounter with the reality of what warfare meant, what soldiers actually did in combat, what the cost of protecting American interests had been for individuals like Frank.
Margaret Chen found herself looking at Frank with completely new eyes.
This quiet, polite man who helped carry groceries and maintained his lawn meticulously had been one of the most effective killers in the United States Army. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming.
"That's—" Robert Hayes began, then stopped. Even with his own military background, he was struggling to process the magnitude of what Frank had revealed.
93 confirmed kills made Frank Morrison one of the most successful snipers in Vietnam War history. Frank seemed to sense the shock and discomfort his revelation had caused.
"I know it's hard to understand," he said gently. "It's hard for me to understand sometimes."
That was a different world, a different time. We were doing what our country asked us to do. Tommy Martinez found his voice.
"Morrison, I'm sorry for thinking—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But Frank understood. "You thought I was just some old man who didn't know what he was doing," Frank said with a slight smile. "That's okay, son. That's what I wanted people to think. It's easier that way." Dr. Walsh was putting together pieces of a psychological puzzle.
The nightmares, the occasional anxiety attacks you've mentioned during our appointments. They're related to your service, aren't they? Frank nodded. PTSD, they call it now.
We didn't have a name for it back then. We just called it getting on with life.
He looked down at his trembling hands again. Some things never really go away. You just learn to live with them. The community center had fallen into a reverent quiet as people processed what they had learned. They were in the presence of a genuine war hero, a man whose skills and sacrifices had contributed to American military efforts in one of the nation's most controversial conflicts. But they were also confronting the reality that heroism often comes with costs that extend far beyond the battlefield. Sarah Peterson, the teacher, was thinking about the historical significance of what they had discovered. "Mr. Morrison, have you ever considered sharing your story? There are organizations that collect veterans' experiences for historical preservation."
Frank shook his head slowly. "I've spent 50 years trying to forget most of it. Why would I want to remember it all now?"
But even as he said the words, something in his expression suggested that the events of the morning had stirred something in him that had been dormant for decades. The precision shooting, the revelation of his past, the respectful attention of his community. Perhaps it was time to acknowledge that his service had meant something, that his sacrifices had value, that his story was worth preserving. The shooting gallery had become something entirely different from what Margaret Chen had intended when she planned the event. It had become a window into history, a revelation of the extraordinary lives that ordinary people sometimes conceal, and a reminder that heroes often walk among us in disguise. But the story was far from over. Frank Morrison's revelations had answered some questions while raising many others. How had he transitioned from being one of the Army's most effective snipers to living quietly in a small town? What other experiences had shaped his 5 decades of civilian life? And most importantly, what would he do now that his carefully guarded secrets had been revealed to the community he called home? The news of Frank Morrison's revelation spread through the small community like ripples in a still pond. By Sunday morning, nearly everyone in town knew that the quiet man from Maple Street was not who they had thought he was. Phone calls were made, conversations whispered across backyard fences, and the story grew with each telling, though the basic facts remained startling enough without embellishment. Frank himself spent Saturday evening sitting on his front porch, something he hadn't done in months. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from neighborhood fireplaces. But for the first time in decades, Frank wasn't really seeing his peaceful neighborhood. Instead, his mind was traveling back to places he had spent 50 years trying to forget. The jungles of Vietnam seemed impossibly far from his quiet street. Yet the events of the morning had torn down the careful walls he had built between his past and present. The weight of the rifle in his hands, the feel of the trigger, the absolute silence that came with perfect focus. All of it had brought back memories that were both welcome and terrible. He remembered Sergeant Mike Kowalski, his spotter during his first tour. Mike had been killed by a sniper's bullet just 3 weeks before they were supposed to rotate home. Frank had spent the next 2 months hunting the enemy sniper who had taken his friend, finally ending that particular threat on a rainy morning outside Da Nang. The successful hunt had earned Frank a commendation and a reputation that would follow him through his second tour. He remembered Lieutenant Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret Chen from the community center, just one of those coincidences that made him smile sadly. Lieutenant Chen had been the intelligence officer who provided him with target information during his second tour. She had died in a rocket attack on their base camp, along with 6 other soldiers. Frank had requested immediate field assignment the next day, unable to bear the routine of base life after losing another person who had mattered to him. Most of all, he remembered the faces. Not just the faces in his rifle scope, though those haunted him too, but the faces of the young soldiers he had protected with his skills. The 19-year-old kid from Ohio who had written letters to his girlfriend every night until the patrol Frank had been covering from 300 yards away was ambushed. Frank's rifle had ended 3 enemy lives that day, saving 7 American soldiers, including the letter-writing kid who had lived to make it home to marry that girlfriend. These were the memories that the morning shooting had awakened, and Frank found himself struggling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Pride in his skills and his service, mixed with grief for all the lives lost, both American and Vietnamese. Satisfaction at having served his country effectively, tempered by the psychological cost of carrying 93 deaths on his conscience. Walsh had called him Saturday evening, checking to make sure he was all right after the emotional stress of the day's revelations. As his physician, she was concerned about how the psychological upheaval might affect his physical health. As a member of the community, she was curious about the man she was only now beginning to understand. "I'm fine, Doc," Frank had told her over the phone. Maybe better than I've been in years. It felt good to tell the truth for once. But sitting on his porch in the gathering darkness, Frank wasn't entirely sure that was accurate. The truth had indeed been liberating in some ways, but it had also opened doors in his mind that he had kept carefully locked for 5 decades. The nightmares that night were more vivid than they had been in months, filled with jumble sounds and the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Frank's front door. Robert Hayes, the retired Marine, stood on the porch holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression of quiet understanding. "Thought you might want some company," Robert said simply. "Sometimes the day after you tell your story is harder than keeping it secret." Frank invited him in, grateful for the presence of someone who might understand the complexity of what he was feeling. They sat in Frank's simple living room, surrounded by the comfortable furniture and family photographs that had defined his civilian identity for decades. 93, Robert said after they had settled with their coffee. "That's not just impressive, it's historically significant. You know that, right?" Frank shrugged uncomfortably. "Numbers don't mean much." Each one was a person. Someone's son, maybe someone's father. I try not to think about it in terms of statistics. "But you saved lives too," Robert pointed out. "Every enemy soldier you eliminated was someone who couldn't kill American troops. That has to count for something." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "You know what's funny?" he said finally. "Yesterday was the first time I've held a rifle in 20 years. I thought maybe the skills were gone, that maybe age and the tremor had finally taken them away, but it all came back. Like riding a bicycle, I guess." Robert nodded. "Muscle memory is powerful, especially when it's been burned in by that kind of intensive training and experience. You were elite, weren't you? Not just regular infantry." Frank hesitated, then seemed to make another decision about how much truth to share. "They called us special projects back then. Officially, we didn't exist. Unofficially, we were the guys they sent when they needed someone eliminated and couldn't afford to miss." The implications of that revelation were staggering. Frank Morrison hadn't just been a sniper, he had been part of the military's most classified and sensitive operations in Vietnam. The kind of soldier whose very existence was denied by official channels, whose missions were too sensitive to acknowledge even decades later. "Black Ops," Robert said, understanding immediately. "Jesus, Frank, no wonder you've kept this quiet." "It wasn't supposed to be permanent," Frank said. I was supposed to do one special assignment and then rotate back to regular duties, but I was good at it, and they kept finding reasons to extend my assignment. 2 tours turned into something else entirely. Robert was beginning to understand the true magnitude of Frank Morrison's service and sacrifice. How did you transition back to civilian life? That kind of specialized work, it must have been nearly impossible to just walk away from. Frank's laugh was bitter. It wasn't easy. The Army didn't exactly have a reintegration program for guys like me. They gave me an honorable discharge, a Purple Heart I never wanted, and told me to figure it out on my own. So I came here, found a job at the factory, and spent 50 years pretending to be someone else. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Frank opened it to find Margaret Chen standing on his porch, holding a small wrapped package and looking somewhat nervous. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I wanted to bring you something and to apologize for putting you in that position yesterday." Frank invited her in and introduced her to Robert. Margaret sat down and handed Frank the package, which contained the target from his shooting demonstration, carefully preserved between 2 pieces of cardboard. "I thought you should have this," she said. "It's remarkable, and it's yours." Frank unwrapped the target and stared at it for a long moment. 3 holes so perfectly aligned they looked like a single elongated opening in the exact center of the bullseye. It was proof of skills he had spent decades trying to forget, evidence of a part of himself he had thought was buried forever.
"Thank you," he said quietly.
"I'm not sure what I'll do with it, but thank you." Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Mr. Take so completely of herself. "Morrison, I also wanted to ask you something. The veterans organization that benefited from yesterday's fundraiser, they're always looking for speakers, people who can share their experiences with younger veterans, with school groups, with community organizations. Would you consider—" "No," Frank said immediately. "I'm sorry, but no. What happened yesterday it was an accident. I didn't mean to open all this up again." But Robert leaned forward. "Frank, maybe she's got a point. There are young veterans struggling with PTSD, with reintegration issues, with feeling like their service doesn't matter. Your story could help them." "My story is about killing people," Frank replied bluntly. "How is that supposed to help anyone?" "Your story is about service," Margaret said gently, "about sacrifice, about doing what your country asked you to do under impossible circumstances, about surviving trauma and building a meaningful life afterward." Frank looked down at the target in his hands, at the evidence of skills that had defined the most important and most difficult period of his life. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've spent so long trying to be someone else. I'm not sure I know how to be that person again." The 3 of them sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. Outside, the sounds of suburban Sunday morning continued. Children playing, lawnmowers starting up, neighbors calling greetings to each other across driveways. It was the peaceful civilian life that Frank had built for himself, but it was also a life built on carefully maintained silence about who he really was. Robert broke the silence. "You know what I think, Frank? I think yesterday wasn't an accident. I think some part of you was ready for people to know the truth. Maybe it's time to stop hiding from your own history." Margaret nodded in agreement. "You don't have to become a public speaker or write a book or anything dramatic. But maybe there's a middle ground between total secrecy and full disclosure. Maybe there are ways to honor your service without reliving all the trauma." Frank Morrison looked at his 2 visitors, at the people who represented his community's evolving understanding of who he was. Yesterday morning, he had been the quiet old man from Maple Street. Today, he was a decorated Vietnam veteran whose skills and service had saved countless American lives at enormous personal cost. The question now was who he would choose to be tomorrow, and in all the days that followed. The secret was out. The careful walls between his past and present had been breached, and there was no going back to the anonymity he had maintained for 5 decades. But maybe, Frank thought as he studied the perfect holes in the paper target, going back wasn't what he wanted anymore. Maybe it was time to find a way to honor both the soldier he had been and the man he had become, to integrate the 2 sides of his identity, instead of keeping them forever separate. The decision would shape not only his own future, but also his relationship with the community that was still learning to understand the extraordinary man who had been living quietly among them all these years. 3 months after the shooting gallery incident, Frank Morrison found himself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting the collar of a shirt he hadn't worn in 20 years. The American Legion Post had invited him to speak at their monthly meeting, and after weeks of gentle persuasion from Robert Hayes and Margaret Chen, he had finally agreed. The tremor in his hands was more pronounced today, whether from nervousness or the progression of his condition he couldn't tell. But as he had learned that Saturday morning at the community center, some things transcended physical limitations when the purpose was important enough. The past 3 months had been a journey of gradual revelation and careful integration of his two identities. Word of his military service had spread through the community in the way that significant news travels in small towns. Respectfully, but thoroughly. People's interactions with him had changed, but not in the ways he had feared. Mrs. Patterson, his elderly neighbor, had brought him homemade cookies and thanked him for his service with tears in her eyes. She told him that her brother had died in Vietnam, and knowing that soldiers like Frank had been there fighting to protect others gave her comfort she hadn't felt in decades. Tommy Martinez, the teenager who had initially been amused by Frank's shooting gallery attempt, had started stopping by regularly to help with yard work. Tommy never asked directly about Frank's military experience, but their conversations gradually revealed a young man hungry for mentorship and meaning, someone who was beginning to understand that real strength often came disguised as quiet humility. Dr. Walsh had worked with Frank to develop better strategies for managing his PTSD symptoms, now that they could discuss his experiences openly. The tremor remained, but the nightmares had actually decreased in frequency and intensity. It seemed that decades of suppressed memories were less traumatic when brought into the light and examined with professional help and community support. The shooting range in the next county had extended an open invitation for Frank to use their facilities whenever he wanted. Word had somehow reached them about the 93 confirmed kills and the perfect shooting display, and they were eager to have such a distinguished marksman as a member. Frank had politely declined, explaining that his shooting days were behind him, but he appreciated the recognition. More significantly, 3 young veterans from recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan had sought him out for conversations about transitioning to civilian life. Robert Hayes had facilitated these meetings, recognizing that Frank's experience with reintegration, though from a different era, might offer valuable insights to soldiers struggling with their own demons. The first veteran was Maria Santos, a former Army medic who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and was struggling with survivor's guilt after losing several soldiers she had tried to save. Frank's ability to articulate the burden of carrying responsibility for other people's lives, both saved and lost, had helped her begin to process her own trauma in healthier ways. The second was David Kim, a former Marine whose sniper training had never been put to use in combat, but who was dealing with the psychological preparation he had undergone for taking human lives. Frank's honest discussion of the mental and emotional costs of actually using those skills had helped David understand that his struggles were normal and valid, even without combat experience. The third was James Wright, a former Navy SEAL whose special operations background had left him feeling isolated and misunderstood by civilian society. Frank's example of building a meaningful civilian life while honoring his military service had shown James that integration was possible, even after the most intensive and secretive military careers. These conversations had been transformative for Frank as well. For the first time in 50 years, he was able to discuss his experiences with people who understood the weight of military service and the challenges of civilian transition. He discovered that helping other veterans process their trauma was helping him process his own in ways that decades of private struggle had never achieved. Margaret Chen had been true to her word about not pushing Frank into unwanted public roles, but she had found subtle ways to honor his service within the community. The Veterans Organization now had a small memorial garden behind the community center, and Frank had been quietly involved in its design and planning. He had also become an unofficial advisor to the organization, helping them better understand and serve veterans from different eras and different types of service. The local high school history teacher had approached Frank about participating in an oral history project, and after much consideration, he had agreed to be interviewed about his Vietnam experience. The interview would be preserved in the school's archives and the local historical society, providing future generations with first-hand testimony about one of America's most complex military conflicts. Frank had been careful to focus his recorded testimony on the broader themes of service, sacrifice, and the costs of war, rather than on specific operations or classified details. He spoke about the bonds between soldiers, the weight of responsibility for other people's lives, and the challenges of returning to civilian society after experiencing combat. His story became part of a larger tapestry of veteran experiences that would help students understand the human cost of military service. Now, as he prepared to address the American Legion meeting, Frank reflected on how much his life had changed since that Saturday morning when he had simply wanted to participate in a community activity. The secret he had guarded so carefully for 5 decades was no longer a burden he carried alone. Instead, it had become a bridge connecting him more deeply to his community and to fellow veterans who needed to know that successful transition from military to civilian life was possible. The American Legion post was crowded that evening with veterans from Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan all present to hear Frank speak. Robert Hayes had introduced him simply as a neighbor who has a story worth hearing, without revealing the dramatic details that would make the evening truly memorable. Frank began quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he described his early life and his decision to enlist during the Vietnam era. He spoke about basic training, about arriving in country, about the gradual realization that war was nothing like what he had expected from movies and television. As he continued, describing his selection for specialized sniper training and his eventual assignment to classified operations, the room grew increasingly quiet. These were all veterans, men and women who understood the weight of military service, but Frank's story was exceptional even within that community of exceptional people. When he mentioned the 93 confirmed kills, a collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Several of the Vietnam veterans present had known snipers during their service, but none had known anyone with that level of documented success. It was a number that placed Frank Morrison among the most effective combat soldiers in American military history. But Frank didn't dwell on the statistics. Instead, he talked about the psychological costs of that effectiveness, the burden of carrying so much responsibility for life and death decisions, the challenge of maintaining humanity while performing duties that required the taking of human life. His honesty about the mental health struggles that had followed his service resonated powerfully with veterans from all eras who had faced their own psychological challenges. He described his return to civilian life, his decision to seek anonymity rather than recognition, his decades of careful silence about his military experience. He talked about the isolation that came with carrying secrets, the difficulty of building relationships when fundamental parts of your identity couldn't be shared, the gradual erosion of self that came from pretending to be someone else for 50 years. Then he talked about the morning at the shooting gallery, about the moment when his carefully constructed civilian identity had collided with his military past in front of his entire community. He described the fear and liberation of having his secrets revealed, the discovery that the community response had been support rather than judgment, the gradual realization that honoring his military service didn't require abandoning his civilian identity. As Frank concluded his remarks, he looked out at the assembled veterans and spoke directly to the challenges many of them were facing. "I wasted 50 years thinking that my military service was something to hide from," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I thought that being a good civilian meant forgetting that I had ever been a soldier. But I was wrong. The skills I learned in the Army, the experiences I had in Vietnam, the responsibility I carried for other people's lives, those things didn't make me less qualified for civilian life. They made me more qualified. They gave me capabilities and perspectives that my community needed, even if I was too afraid to share them." He paused, looking down at his trembling hands, then back up at his audience. "Your service matters. Your experiences matter. Your struggles matter. Don't make my mistake and spend decades hiding from who you really are. Find ways to integrate your military identity with your civilian life. Your community needs what you have to offer, even if you can't see it yet." The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. Veterans who had struggled with their own reintegration issues found hope in Frank's story of eventually finding balance and purpose. Older veterans who had also kept their service experiences private began to reconsider whether their silence was really necessary. Younger veterans dealing with PTSD and survivor's guilt saw an example of someone who had carried similar burdens and eventually found ways to transform that trauma into service to others. After the formal meeting ended, Frank was surrounded by veterans wanting to thank him, to share their own stories, to ask for advice about their own struggles. He stayed late into the evening, listening to their experiences and offering what wisdom he could from his own journey of healing and integration. Robert Hayes drove Frank home that night, and they sat in the driveway for several minutes before Frank got out of the car. "How do you feel?" Robert asked. Frank considered the question carefully. "Different," he said finally. "For 50 years, I felt like I was living two separate lives that could never be connected. Tonight, for the first time, I felt like they were finally the same life." 6 months later, Frank Morrison was a different man, though the changes were subtle rather than dramatic. He still lived in the same house on Maple Street, still maintained his lawn meticulously, still shopped for groceries on Tuesday mornings. But the careful anonymity that had defined his civilian life had been replaced by quiet integration of his military and civilian identities. He had begun volunteering at the VA Medical Center, working with veterans who were struggling with PTSD and reintegration issues. His ability to articulate the challenges of civilian transition, combined with his obvious success in building a meaningful post-military life, made him an effective mentor for younger veterans. The tremor in his hands remained, and his physical limitations continued to increase with age. But the psychological burden that had amplified those physical symptoms had been significantly reduced. Walsh noted improvements in his sleep patterns, his anxiety levels, and his overall mental health that correlated directly with his decision to integrate rather than hide his military service. The community's relationship with Frank had also evolved. He was no longer just the quiet old man from Maple Street. He was a local hero whose service and sacrifice had contributed to American military efforts during one of the nation's most challenging conflicts. But the respect he received was tempered by understanding of the costs that service had entailed, making the recognition meaningful rather than merely celebratory. Tommy Martinez had enlisted in the Marines, influenced partly by his conversations with Frank about service, duty, and the importance of having purposes larger than oneself. Frank had been honest with Tommy about both the rewards and the costs of military service, helping the young man make an informed decision about his future. The shooting gallery target from that Saturday morning was now framed and hanging in Frank's living room, not as a trophy but as a reminder of the day when he had finally stopped running from his own history. Visitors to his home often asked about it, and Frank had learned to tell the story with pride rather than reluctance. Margaret Chen had been elected president of the Veterans Organization, and Frank served as an unofficial advisor, helping them develop programs that served veterans from all eras and all types of service. The organization had grown significantly, partly due to increased community awareness of veterans' needs that had been sparked by Frank's story. As Frank Morrison approached his 73rd birthday, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from that morning at the shooting gallery to his current role as a community elder and veteran advocate. The path hadn't been easy, and there were still difficult days when the memories of Vietnam seemed too heavy to carry. But he had learned that carrying those memories alone was much harder than sharing them with people who could understand and support him. He had discovered that his military service, rather than being something to hide from, was actually one of his greatest qualifications for serving his community in civilian life. Most importantly, he had realized that the quiet heroism he had demonstrated in Vietnam, the willingness to accept responsibility for other people's lives, the determination to complete difficult missions regardless of personal cost, the ability to function effectively under extreme pressure, were exactly the qualities his community needed from its elders and leaders. Frank Morrison's story had become a reminder to his entire community that heroism often walks among us in disguise, that the most extraordinary people sometimes appear to be the most ordinary, and that everyone has depths and capabilities that may never be visible until the right moment calls them forth. The old veteran had stopped hiding from his past and had learned to use his experience to serve his community in new ways. In doing so, he had discovered that the transition from military to civilian life was not about forgetting who he had been as a soldier, but about finding ways to honor that service while building something meaningful and lasting in peacetime. His story would be told and retold in their small town for generations to come, not just as entertainment but as inspiration for others who might be hiding their own capabilities, their own service, their own potential contributions to the communities they call home. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply let people know who we really are. They laughed when the old veteran took the rifle. Seconds later, no one spoke.